The Challenger disaster was never an unavoidable tragedy, but the forensic truth shows it was completely preventable from the very first warning. Engineers had warned NASA for months about the cold destroying the critical O-ring seals on the solid rocket boosters. Management, every chart, and every desperate plea to protect the launch schedule and the political image of the Reagan administration. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center into a freezing Florida morning that no one should have allowed. 73 seconds later, it experienced structural breakup, visible to millions. The 7 astronauts aboard did not survive the event. This was not some random mechanical failure or act of God. It was the direct result of a calculated decision made in conference rooms where schedule pressure and billions in contracts outweighed human lives. Dated July 27, 1985, warning of a potential failure of the highest order if the seals failed in cold conditions. The launch temperature sat at 36 degrees Fahrenheit, breaking every previous record for a shuttle liftoff. The overnight low had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit at the pad, leaving icicles hanging from the gantry and frost coating the external tank. Previous coldest launch in December 1985 at 53 degrees Fahrenheit had already shown troubling erosion, yet the data was filed away instead of acted upon. The shuttle program faced severe budget cuts in the early 1980s, and the pressure to maintain launch cadence was relentless. Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian teacher selected for the mission, symbolized a public relations triumph meant to inspire school children nationwide. The historical context reveals a program marketed as reliable and reusable, yet built on a known vulnerability in the field joints of the solid rocket boosters. Those rubber O-rings were supposed to seal explosive gases, but they lost resiliency in cold weather, becoming brittle and failing to seat properly. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had flagged the issue repeatedly. By 1985, the warnings had grown urgent and specific. The stage was set for tragedy when the decision to launch proceeded despite every indicator pointing to disaster. The documented record shows the key decision-makers sat in NASA headquarters conference rooms and Morton Thiokol boardrooms, far from the launch pad. They overruled their own engineers under intense schedule pressure. From the White House, safety was sacrificed for deadlines and optics. Morton Thiokol engineers had recommended no launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit based on extensive test data. NASA managers pressured Thiokol executives to reverse their initial no-go vote during a 2.5-hour teleconference on January 27th. Chief engineer Roger Boisjoly pleaded for 2 hours straight, laying out the forensic evidence of past erosion. Bob Eveling, another Morton Thiokol engineer, called it a dire warning in private conversations, predicting they faced serious risk of losing a shuttle. Alan McDonald, the Thiokol director of solid rocket motors, stood alone, refusing to sign the launch approval form. The documented record is clear. The agency and contractor chose image over evidence. But how many lives was the schedule worth? The promise of revelations begins with the exact ignored memos, the desperate pleas captured on transcripts, and the politics that made the entire event completely preventable. You will read Boisjoly's handwritten warning from July 1985. You will hear Ebeling's voice breaking on the call the night before. You will see how bureaucratic go fever and White House expectations sealed the fate of the crew. January 1986 marked a pivotal and dangerous moment for the American space program. The shuttle fleet was still relatively new, with only 24 successful missions completed. Budget constraints from the Reagan era demanded frequent launches to justify the enormous costs to taxpayers. Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian teacher selected for the mission, was meant to teach lessons from space and bring the program into living rooms across the country. The overnight temperature dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit at Kennedy Space Center, created conditions far outside the tested envelope for the O-rings. Morton Thiokol engineers had recommended no launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, yet that recommendation was overridden. The shuttle stood on the pad encased in ice with icicles hanging from the structure like warnings no one wanted to see. Engineers on site expressed grave concerns about the cold affecting the seals, but the chain of command pushed forward anyway. This descent into disaster began long before the countdown reached zero. The mounting tension built steadily in the claustrophobic control rooms and over the teleconference lines. Engineers presented 13 charts showing O-ring failure rates, skyrocketing below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Managers demanded a management decision and dismissed the warnings as overly conservative. Thiokol initially voted no launch, then reversed under intense pressure from NASA. NASA had known about the O-ring joint rotation problem since 1982, but had never fully addressed it. Power levels and data flowed across the screens, but the human element of concern was overruled by demands for a go decision. Automatic safety protocols were secondary to the schedule. The engineers knew the physics. The rubber would stiffen in the cold, failing to seal the joint under the immense pressure of ignition. Each ignored chart and overridden objection deepened the descent into catastrophe. The atmosphere in the rooms grew oppressive under the harsh glow of overhead lights. Voices of caution were silenced by the weight of political expectations. The graphite in the boosters, and the water coolant in the system created conditions that were pushed beyond limits. The system was rushed in the name of completing the mission on schedule. This phase exposed the fragile line between routine procedure and impending doom. The crew, including Krista McAuliffe, boarded the orbiter unaware of the debate that had raged the night before. Families watched from the viewing area filled with pride and excitement. No one at the pad knew the full extent of the risk that had been accepted in those closed-door meetings. The cold wind whipped across the pad as the countdown continued. The evidence of danger had been there, in black and white for years, yet it was buried under layers of bureaucratic denial. 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 28, 1986, Challenger lifted off into the clear blue sky. At 58 seconds after launch, a telltale plume of smoke appeared from the right solid rocket booster joint. 73 seconds later, the vehicle experienced structural breakup as the external tank ruptured and the boosters veered off course. Debris fell into the Atlantic Ocean for hours afterward. The crew compartment separated and continued its ballistic arc before impacting the water. The event unfolded in visible detail for those watching live on television. The ORIN seal in the right booster had failed due to the extreme cold, allowing hot gases to erode the joint and eventually breach the external tank. The event resulted in the loss of all 7 lives at the moment of breakup, though the exact details remained classified for years. The booster joint leak started small but grew rapidly under the immense pressure of flight. The vehicle experienced structural separation under aerodynamic forces. Debris fields stretched across miles of ocean. The impact extended far beyond the launch pad as families of the astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe's students, witnessed the event in real time. Smoke and debris became visible across the sky where moments earlier there had been a perfect descent. The launch pad fell silent as the smoke cleared. Recovery ships were dispatched immediately, but the scale of the debris field made the search grueling. The aftermath saw the launch pad empty and the fleet grounded for 32 months. Families watched the event from the viewing area as the sky filled with smoke and falling fragments. NASA officials scrambled to contain the narrative while recovery teams combed the waters for evidence. The event marked the beginning of a long reckoning for the space agency. The documented physics of the flawed design combined with operational decisions produced a disaster of significant scale. The cold had stiffened the O-rings exactly as predicted, yet the launch had been allowed to proceed. The remains of the crew were eventually recovered, but the truth took longer to surface. This was the moment when the ignored warnings became undeniable reality. The official response began almost immediately as NASA officials called it an unavoidable accident. They claimed no one could have predicted the effects of the unprecedented cold. The controlled narrative protected billions in government contracts and the future of the shuttle program. Initial statements minimized the role of prior warnings and blamed unforeseen circumstances. The Presidential Commission, formed on February 3, 1986, faced resistance when requesting internal documents. Morton Theocole and NASA initially denied the extent of the O-Rhine concerns in public testimony. The official handling shielded the agency from immediate accountability, while the public mourned. Engineers who had spoken out were sidelined or discredited. The 32-month grounding of the fleet came only after intense scrutiny. This systematic approach delayed the truth and prevented immediate reforms. Officials in Washington and Houston crafted statements that downplayed the engineering data available for years. The controlled narrative served the powerful, while the families of the lost astronauts grieved in private. The official response extended to press briefings, where questions about temperature effects were deflected. It would take months for the full picture to emerge, but the initial wall of denial held firm. The agency chose image preservation over honest reckoning. The launch complex itself became a place of quiet reflection after the fact. Official releases continued to emphasize the greatness of the program even as the investigation unfolded. The controlled narrative was carefully constructed to maintain public support and funding. The Rogers Commission proved the official handling beyond doubt. Physicist Richard Feynman conducted his famous ice water demonstration on live television, exposing the O-ring stiffness in cold conditions. Declassified memos and teleconference transcripts confirmed every ignored warning. The discovery phase brought the forensic truth into the light after months of concealment. The commission report, released in June 1986, laid bare the culture of go fever at NASA. Boisjoly's 1985 memo and the January 27 teleconference recordings became public evidence. Modern analysis of the recovered debris confirmed the joint failure sequence exactly as the engineers had predicted. The abandoned launch pad stands as a silent witness, with its frozen gantry cables and warning signs fading in the salt air. These revelations demonstrate that the disaster was foreseeable and that the handling reflected a deliberate strategy of risk acceptance. The documented reality of Challenger was not just a technical failure, but a profound failure of leadership and accountability. Full Rogers Commission transcripts are now declassified. Over 30 years later, new memos continue to surface, painting an even clearer picture of institutional decisions. The pattern of bureaucratic denial repeats in agency after agency when power and prestige are at stake. Schedule pressure always defeats safety when bureaucracies prioritize deadlines over data. NASA proved that organizations will bury warnings to save face and maintain funding. 7 lives paid the price for preventable choices rooted in political ambition. The disaster accelerated a complete redesign of the solid rocket boosters and led to stricter safety protocols across the agency. It serves as a stark reminder that ignoring engineers costs lives, and that transparency must override institutional inertia. The past is never buried. Hit subscribe for more forensic truths they tried to hide. Next, we expose the real reason Apollo 1 burned. What's buried always surfaces. Until next time, stay blessed.